The classic PS2 entries in the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater series are back, gloriously redesigned for modern hardware and working off the excellent gameplay engine established in the previous remake, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1+2. From the announcement teaser, this instantly became one of my most anticipated games of the year. Of course, a reality check coming in alongside the official reveal quickly brought things back into perspective and set expectations a bit lower. See, while this announcement was seemingly for remakes of both Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, the fourth entry in the Pro Skater series is sort of the odd one out, even at time of release. Pro Skater 4 served as a major turning point as it redefined the overall structure and production value for the games going forward, moving them away from quick bursts of timed arcade-like challenges and instead towards an open-world, mission-based, and eventually story-driven direction. While it would take another entry after Pro Skater 4 to introduce a true story, the gameplay shifts occurred here, and the production value skyrocketed to new heights. The amount of goals per stage roughly doubled, and despite having no focused narrative, each of its objectives featured full voice acting. Combine that with the new formula closer to that of an open world, and the next evolution of the series was no doubt felt with this entry. However, when it comes to this now series of Pro Skater remakes, the innovations and changes made in Pro Skater 4 turned out to be a little more than the teams at developer Iron Galaxy and publisher Activision were willing to bite off. Snuck into the official statement accompanying the initial trailer revealed that Pro Skater 4 would be retrofitted to have the gameplay format of its predecessors, something that immediately tipped off fans to the very real fact that this version of Pro Skater 4 would be significantly different from the original. Upon this announcement, I knew that I would want to compare both versions of the games to see how everything shook out. As a big fan of the original Pro Skater 4, I started to realize that much of the game was defined by its new structure and charm of the voice acting, so how would a remake fare with those gutted? Naturally, I was still excited to see the game's maps again and curious as to how the remake would handle all the various aspects that don't clearly translate into the 2-minute formula, like cutscenes and temporary set pieces. Pro Skater 4 was actually my introduction to the series and one of the first games I ever played through this jam-packed demo collection. Looking at it now, this definitely shaped many of my gaming tastes. Regardless, today we'll be taking a look at this remake and the original, comparing largely everything from the structure, goals, and levels to the presentation, bonuses, and overall content offerings. Let's see just how faithful they were able to make this remake, and overall, which of these versions reign supreme. Real quick, I did want to address the elephant in the room that is Pro Skater 3. This remake is, of course, a combination bringing forward both Pro Skater 3 and Pro Skater 4, so what's up with only talking about the latter? While Pro Skater 3 does come with some notable changes and removals like not bringing over goals specific to a skater style, the overall comparison is far more familiar than Pro Skater 4 considering the latter's complete restructuring. Pro Skater 3's remake, compared to its original, is faithful enough to avoid being a terribly interesting source of comparison, and since I have more experience and nostalgia for Pro Skater 4, I wanted to instead hone in on its plethora of significant differences. Of course, we'll still need to refer to the Pro Skater 3 side of things, since the nature of this being a package deal does impact the progression of Pro Skater 4 as well, but without further ado, let's jump straight into the most all-encompassing change from original to remake. Starting us off is probably the most controversial yet impactful difference between the two versions of Pro Skater 4, that of course being the structure of the main career mode. The original Pro Skater 4 pioneered a freer and more open approach to goals that went on to define the entries in the series that would follow it, while the remake instead decides to walk things back in order to fit with the gameplay formula of the original trilogy and the other remakes. To best understand the evolution that Pro Skater 4 was at the time, let's first look at the remake, since that will also serve as a refresh on the original format the series began with. Here, career mode consists of 9 levels, all but the first of which require a certain amount of completed level goals or placement in a dedicated competition level in order to unlock them. Things are immediately familiar if you played any of the classic entries in the series, or more likely, 2020's Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1+2. The player is presented with 10 goals to complete, after which they are loaded in a set starting point for the level and placed on a 2-minute timer. Now, you don't have to complete all the goals within a single 2-minute run. Anywhere from all to just one of the goals can be attempted, and the game will cross any achieved goals off once the timer runs out. Since a majority of the additional levels are unlocked from completing goals, players that want to see more of the game will naturally strive to complete as many challenges as they can before moving on. For the main career mode, the requirement for the next level will always be some amount of goals shy of what you have available, so a particularly hard challenge can be skipped or put off until later. This right here is the tried and true formula the remade Pro Skater games have chosen to revolve around, and for the first 3 games this is largely matched by their originals. While there's really no benefit or penalty for doing so, I think the best part about this gameplay structure is the fun one can have from attempting multiple goals at once, as otherwise many individual goals aren't impacted one way or another by the time limit due to their simplicity. Similar to its predecessors, Remake Pro Skater 4 has very repetitive and formulaic goals level to level. We'll discuss it more in depth when we compare specific goals, but a majority of the base campaign's 10 goals per park are carried over each time. Each one will have 3 score challenges, collect the skate letters, a combo score challenge, and a secret tape, leaving just 4 remaining that can be level specific. However, due to the timer, even these are often quicker scavenger hunt challenges that don't ask much of the player as far as engaging with the trick system goes, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Swapping now over to the original Pro Skater 4, we have what could certainly be considered a complete overhaul of the previous system. Goals are still a means of progression, but the amount per stage has over doubled. Loading into a park, we can see that there's no longer a timer, and instead the player can free roam the level as they please. Goals this time around are given individually by NPC characters that are placed throughout the map, complete with fully voiced explanations.
Bloody coppers don't us bleeding skating anywhere. Haven't they got nothing better to do, you know what I mean? Grab each of their bleeding hats by doing a grab trick over them, that'll sort them out.
In addition to a clear increase in production value, immersion, and comedic potential, this format also allows for numerous gameplay improvements. Firstly, this new way of conducting the career essentially brings together the old free skate mode and the previous career modes to make for a feeling that is a bit more inviting than that offered in said previous campaigns. I often find myself testing lines and exploring the level in between goals, and for quite a bit more time and to a greater extent since there isn't a time limit in goals looming overhead at all times. Additionally, since not all goals are given at once, the individual goals can have their own custom start points and time limits, leading to infinitely more possibilities when it comes to constructing challenges for the players. Hold on to this for later, as this severely differentiates the quality of specific goals from original to remake. Some objectives even add additional terrain, obstacles, and set pieces, which was something I honestly had no idea how the remake would choose to adapt. Many of the same goal types return here, but with over double the goals like mentioned previously, there's quite a bit of room for level-specific goals to now outnumber the generic ones. Now, when it comes to pacing, an argument can definitely be made in favor of the 2-minute format, as all the goals are available at once, and you can even knock out all the score challenges in one run by achieving the highest one. By comparison, since all the goals in the original, even score challenges, are separate and require finding and talking to an individual NPC, there is more start and stop for sure. The original Pro Skater 4 even prompts you to save and apply stat points after every goal, so it's more of an ordeal to start playing again compared to just starting a new run. However, this sort of brings me to the disappointment regarding the potential of this remake. If this remake had actually set out to be faithful in its adaptation of the original structure, there are numerous ways to cut back on the downtime through obvious quality of life features, like autosave for starters as a real no-brainer. Though even the later Tony Hawk games removed the post-goal stop, so there was already a blueprint for the improved flow. Similar to the previous Pro Skater Remake 1+2, there were even more opportunities to improve and force formula, but alas, that was the road not taken. Instead of that, we get this version of 4 that has to cram itself into an unfitting shape in order to transition into the old format. And without getting specific on goal quality, the ones that are attempted to be carried over are often generic. I have to assume that this is the case due to the 2-minute format not allowing for goal-specific start and retry points, so insane lines like Escape from Alcatraz and most of the pro challenges aren't able to adapt into this style at all. Additionally, all alternative gameplay styles and minigames had to go too, since transitioning to an entirely different control scheme in a timed context probably wasn't reasonable, and let's face it, they probably didn't want to program a bunch of minigames in general. But can the remake even call itself Pro Skater 4 without the Kona slalom run or the goofy race against the cops in London? Whatever your opinion, it's clear that just the structure of the normal levels already creates a huge margin of difference between the two versions, and we haven't even addressed the many specific goal styles and the real kicker, competition levels. Competitions are a staple of classic Pro Skater. In the first 3 games, every few levels or so would be a smaller, dedicated competition map. There wouldn't be any of the normal goals to complete. Instead, the player would attempt 3 1-minute, high-score runs, the best 2 of which would be added together for a final score. Placing in the top 3 would allow you to move on to the next regular stage until a final competition would be used to cap off the career. Pro Skater 4 did not function like this though, as every stage was a regular level with goals to complete. However, it didn't remove competitions entirely. Quite the contrary, as instead every level would include at least one competition goal among its other 20, and so undoubtedly it had the best of both worlds. Unfortunately, in what may be the most baffling decision in the remake, 2 otherwise complete levels, Kona and Zoo, were stripped of all goals and made dedicated to competition spaces. I'll be honest, there's a ton to be disappointed by here. First off, another huge hit to the overall goal quantity comparison here, but wow, these 2 levels might have had some of the most iconic goals in the game, and no attempt is made here to replace or adapt them. I mentioned the iconic Kona slalom run just a little bit ago, and yeah, this goal and some others like the Misty Flip over the hut were frustrating, but I would make both the argument that those goals, even if frustrating, are part of the game and fun to overcome, but also that there was again loads of potential with which to improve these missions. On the flip side, it's safe to say that these levels did not have a great potential to be converted into solely competition levels. The competitions in the original were often set in just a part of the overall level, since the parks here are massive compared to what came before, and even just a chunk has a wide variety of geometry to work off of. Some of them even limited the play area in order to promote a certain style of tricks, like the Flatland competition in London. These all-encompassing competitions, though, are much larger and lack synergy, as the various set pieces in these levels aren't built to all flow into one another, so many players are likely to experience one of two different issues. My prediction is that newer players are likely to jump between areas without identifying obvious combo opportunities, while experienced players are likely to settle down in one part of the level and excel without experiencing everything the park has to offer. Additionally, in the remake, the competition at Zoo is used to anticlimactically finish off the main campaign, whereas the original had unique pro challenges to finish the career depending on your skater of choice, all of which have been, of course, removed in the remake. These were so fun and memorable, in addition to providing often a unique challenge as opposed to competitions, which always kind of felt samey to me. Things like the movie stunt for the creative skater and the downhill shopping cart challenge for Bam are just a few of the iconic pro objectives lost to the remake. Back on the subject of competitions though, I was already feeling like I was spending much less time in the regular levels, but with these the difference in longevity is tenfold. Now yes, I could obviously just switch to free skate and play around in the levels to my heart's content, but not only is that an even bigger pace breaker than what the original 4 offered between goals, but the structure difference either necessitated or allowed for noticeably and significantly less content overall. I'd say it's also worth mentioning that you can't get any of the collectible stat points, money, or other items in free skate, further decentivizing utilizing that mode. Speaking of the collectibles though, this section is also probably the best place to discuss the other forms of progression in both games, those being currency and upgrades, both of which are handled differently version to version. In the original, levels were filled to the brim with money to pick up, each rewarding $100. However, in the remake, the amount of bundles were drastically reduced to no more than a few per stage, but to make up for this, the pickups are now worth $1,000. I actually think this is a positive change though, since these more rewarding bundles can be placed in interesting locations rather than the original's approach of placing them haphazardly everywhere. In the remake, finishing a run also rewards the player with a small chunk of change based on your performance, so even if you're not collecting the bundles, you aren't totally broke. Both games use currency to purchase additional superfluous upgrades, but I found myself with a surplus of money in the remake due to there not being much I really wanted to buy. While each of the game's respective shops have additional customization for your created character and some bonus unlockable pro skaters, the original also had bonus levels and additional skate footage to buy, but in the remake all there ends up being is generic pieces of clothing. Now let's be real, neither game really knocks your socks off in terms of endless customization options. My main issue with the remake's offerings is that there aren't any particularly interesting or funny inclusions. I guess that is unless you count the Taco Bell shirt. It's almost exclusively branded stuff, same goes for the skate decks as well, while these items from the original are just a few of the sillier things on offer there. I just wish there were a few more items in this realm to buy in the remake shop. Moving to the side of stat upgrades, we have another simple change. Like in the original trilogy, stat points are spread out to be picked up in the levels, whereas Pro Skater 4 had them as additional rewards for completing roughly every other goal. Now there's pros to both approaches in my opinion, as having them in the levels fosters exploration and experimentation, while the original streamlines your progression by making them feel more like level ups. It is worth mentioning that in the remake, stat points for max stats are spread across both the Pro Skater 3 and 4 campaigns, so you can't get maxed out just from playing one or the other. Taking into consideration all these progression and structure changes as a whole, I can't say I lean even closely in favor of the changes the remake implemented. Overall, while I don't hate the 2-minute timer formula for these games, I just don't really prefer it. I may be the odd one out, but aside from score challenges, I don't think the looming time limit is particularly complementary to most other objectives, even in the original trilogy. It rightfully doesn't take even close to 2 minutes to say, perform a specific trick in a specific location, or to pick up 5 random objects in a scavenger hunt, doubly so for the other collectibles we talked about. More often than not, it's felt more like an annoyance more than an intentional challenge to run out of time doing most tasks, and I've always felt that while Pro Skater 4 also utilizes a timer for its challenges, they are specific to the task and pretty much always make the challenge clear and intentional. The issue is exacerbated in the remake, which has more collectibles via the secret shop items to find, because you also have to hunt these random items or spots that might demand precision as the intended challenge, but then have the pace broken by having to start over or backtrack due to an unrelated time limit. It's why, while I appreciate the early entries in the series and can have fun playing them, I've always preferred the later games for what I felt was an obvious improvement. However, I will acknowledge that things like this can come down to personal preference, but now that we've laid out the structure comparison, we can finally move into the discussion on specific content and how it's been impacted. Before we can dive into the full-on goals comparison, both in regard to quantity and quality, we need to cover the levels they take place in. The parks are no question the most important part of these games, given that everything from structure to goals exists within them to literally make the experience. Now, the original Pro Skater 4 featured 7 main stages and 2 unlockable in the shop. Unlike its sibling in this remake package, however, 3+4 chose to omit both unlockable parks from the remake, as Chicago and Carnival are nowhere to be found. As many are likely to point out, Chicago is a level originating from Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX, but that doesn't really change the fact that it's a level more associated with Pro Skater at this point, and it had a sizable list of goals to complete nonetheless. Not sure what's up with Carnival at all though, but for whatever reason they've both been left behind, and in their places, the remake actually adds 3 completely new levels to the Pro Skater 4 campaign. I initially thought that these levels would exist separate from either campaign and instead be overall bonuses, but these are explicitly added to the Pro Skater 4 progression, so we've got to address them. First is the new competition stage, Movie Studio, which is pretty self-explanatory setting-wise. The exterior resembles that of a film lot, while the interior has numerous props and green screen sets to trick off of. This one is probably my least favorite of the new additions, as similar to other intended competition levels, it's much smaller in scope, so while its packed design allows for tons of combo potential, it just didn't leave too much of an impact on me personally. Shortly thereafter, though, players are sent to Water Park as a new conventional level. This one was featured heavily in the promotional material, and it's no secret why. What an obviously great concept for a skating level, and the map provides numerous fountains, pools, slides, and pipes to play around with, complete with great combo potential and synergy. It's hard to pick between this and our last new course to discuss as a favorite, but I've got to give credit to this incredibly inspired, abandoned look and feel this park goes for while still having a lot of positive energy. Moving over to said last course, we have Pinball, the bonus awarded for completing the final competition. This level also has its own goal list to complete, and it's another solid concept put to great use. The angle of the stage in particular makes for a fairly unique feel to skating and manualing especially that gives it an identity all of its own. I think all 3 maps, while not quite at the heights of the series peak, are still all quality inclusions that are sure to provide tons of fun. It's just unfortunate that these new maps have to bear the additional criticism that comes with them being replacements for additional maps rather than them just getting to stand wholly on their own merits. I like Carnival and Chicago, but I think I like what these maps offer just a little more, but they're also so radically different from one another that it's hard to nail down an exact science beyond. I had more fun today playing these brand new ones, and that could just be recency bias. I mean, these are the first new conventional levels to grace the series since 2015's infamous Pro Skater 5, so needless to say, it's been a long time coming. But I think the real attention, as is true with any remake, is how the returning content is updated. Of course, I had no doubt that the levels would age beautifully, but as mentioned previously, one of my big questions for the remake was how it would handle the temporary set pieces. Because the original featured an individualized goal structure, certain goals would add additional obstacles to either serve the mission's narrative or provide additional tricking opportunities, most of which would then disappear after completion. My cynical prediction before release was that all of these types of missions would either need to be cut or reworked, but instead I was surprised to see that the developers actually decided to permanently integrate most of these previously temporary fixtures. The floats in College are always present, the bulldozer in Alcatraz, while not moving, is fixed in the courtyard area, and the competition ramps are now the main spotlighted setting in Zoo, and these are just a few examples. Even some details from goals that did not return make an appearance, like the tackle boxes and fishermen from the Sea Lions goal in San Francisco. These numerous instances of attention to detail sort of reshaped how I felt about the remake, because clearly a great deal of love and care did go into bringing these maps back with all their charm and personality, now in a way that feels more complete and alive than ever before. Well, for the most part anyway. I feel the need to acknowledge the final returning level in the career, Zoo. The competition area, like I mentioned before, is now the highlight, but that comes at the expense of every other area being dark and abandoned. This does give it a fresh feel, I guess, but I do think the complete lack of animals and focus in general in those areas of the map do make it the odd one out as far as paying tribute to the original goes. Even the aquatic interior area is sealed off, the only instance I noticed of any area in any level being straight up removed. Now, when it comes to the combo potential of these updated maps overall though, I will admit that I'm by no means an expert player, so I'd say it still remains to be seen if these fixtures all together and at once in any way clutter the maps, but from my more casual perspective, these details are really cool to see. Before I forget, London and Zoo were also changed from daytime levels to be set at night, which I guess makes sense considering that all of the original maps were set during the day in Pro Skater 4, so I understand wanting to diversify the skyboxes a little bit. The presentation overall in these levels are off the charts, not to say the original looks bad or anything, but the added details give off a current generation vibe in the environmental design while not distracting from the gameplay. When it comes to the original, I have a lot of appreciation for the charm of the time, and I'm certainly not the type to have issues with a game's presentation just because it's outdated, so I think the original still shines in its own ways. But with the stage set with the context of both the structure and the parks, it's finally time to address the activities set throughout both these iconic and all new maps, the goals. Let's get the numbers out of the way right from the start. The base Pro Skater 4 campaign consists of 7 levels with 16 goals apiece, ending with a final Pro Challenge goal specific to your skater of choice once you reach 90 career points. That places the goal total for the campaign at 113 objectives. Looking at the postgame, or goals outside the scope of the main career, you have the remaining 14 Pro Challenges, 14 goals from each of the unlockable levels, and 5 additional Pro goals added to the initial maps, making for a final total of 190 goals. The remake, on the other hand, has 9 main levels, 6 of which have 10 initial goals a pop. The other 3 are competition levels, like we've already discussed, so they'll count as 1 each, giving its main campaign a total of 63 goals. The bonus level, Pinball, adds another 10 at the start of the postgame, and then by completing every prior goal in both the Pro Skater 4 and Pro Skater 3 campaigns, 5 pro goals are added to all the existing regular maps, and 1 additional objective is added to all the competition maps, bringing its final total to 111. That's quite a difference. The remake barely exceeds having only about half the goals of both the original's metrics. You might be most wondering what's missing from the remake, but let's first talk about what they share. Both lists for each map have 3 score challenges, 1 high combo challenge, a combo line, and a collection of skate letters to gather. Each of the remake's regular maps also have a secret tape collectible goal and a 4th score challenge, which seems a bit overkill, but add those to the others and you have what comprises 8 of the total 15 goals per map in the remake, just hitting over half. In the remake, the rest are almost entirely pulled from the 2002 original, but are undoubtedly the most simplistic, often prioritizing simple scavenger hunts or a request to perform a specific trick in a specific location. The ones that break from these molds are the outliers, though other than the consistent combo letters in the pro goals are few and far between, and sadly, they're also worse to play. Without a retry button like in the original, it's much more frustrating to backtrack and restart combo letters, or the manual gap in San Francisco, or even sketching the professor's car. By the way, I noticed immediately that none of the 5 pro goals unlocked in the remake match the pro goals from the original, and I feel that maybe because they were just too frustrating to start over. Pro Skater 4 used its formula to up the ante of what a goal could be, so when this game finally allows for combo letters in the list of pro goals, they are the much easier ones available in the base version of the original's list rather than the much harder ones in the pro goals version of the original list. At this point though, and over the course of this whole video, I've actually already mentioned now almost all the different types of goals that were cut wholesale. All the pro challenges, all extra competitions, all the goals revolving around alternate styles of play, and now all the original pro goals. The only other concepts abandoned as a whole that I noticed were the multi-part goals, which makes sense given the structure, and those trick call-out goals. I've heard people look down on these types of goals in the past, but I've always had a soft spot for them given how they usually have tight time limits while still teaching new players a bunch of tricks they may not have tried yet. That does bring me to another point though, and that's the overall way the game provides information during goals. I mentioned way back at the start that I thought the structure of Pro Skater 4 was more inviting, and part of that stems from how the game will often instruct players on how to do an objective. The briefing by the NPC and even the text on screen will often include the button inputs for what you're being asked to do. For expert players, this may not seem like a big deal, but I much prefer this way of conveying instructions to the player. The challenge should be performing the trick or gap, not if you've memorized which of the one of like 10 plus grab directions and variations is an airwalk, to give an example. Even as someone who's played every game in the series, there are a few goals where I had to pause the game to remember what button combination performed what trick, knowing that in the original it would just be on screen while attempting the goal. These little added pace breakers and frustrations from backtracking are going to no doubt be felt by many players to even a greater extreme than I felt them, and I think that's why I was so disappointed overall in the decision to take this approach. It's also probably part of the reason why I never really fell in love with the 2-minute format to begin with, since I was already used to the more user-friendly experience of the later titles. I know there are some that value that side of the experimentation, but I think there's a line between that and what I would consider to be ignoring quality of life improvements. Believe it or not though, the remake actually has something that you can play much closer to the feel of the original 4's goal format and overall structure, albeit in a minor way. The game's tutorial, that I was only driven to thanks to a PlayStation trophy, started to look very familiar the more I played it. Loading into it puts you into a free skate version of the San Francisco map with no time limit and encourages players to partake in missions that teach the basic mechanics of the game by heading to set start points. Doing so presents the player with a brief dialogue given by Tony Hawk, and then a tutorial text is placed on screen while you attempt what's been instructed. After finishing, the player is able to freely skate around or head to the next waypoint to queue up the next tutorial. Are the gears turning yet? This is just a nearly faithful adaptation of 4's original structure. Just here, it follows all the same beats, just missing restart points and time limits, though both of those are shown in other places to clearly be things within the team's capabilities, so what's the deal then? I feel like this kind of blows the doors off this whole thing, because the team was clearly capable of adapting the proper Pro Skater 4 structure, they just decided not to for whatever reason. Many are likely to argue that the game had to be streamlined due to time constraints, but the blueprint is here in the game, almost ready to go. There's even clear improvements like the waypoints being clearer to see from anywhere in the map compared to the old icons, and the post-completion dialogue being done over gameplay. Seriously, am I going insane? This indicates to me that the decision to scale Pro Skater 4 back was due to a creative decision, or perhaps as an excuse to significantly cut back the goals list and other content types. Okay, maybe I'm half joking a little, but it's still baffling to, at the end of all this discussion, see sort of that alternate timeline possibility in real time. Of course, regardless of structure, it's still insane to me how many iconic goals were removed from the Pro Skater 4 campaign, and I just can't stress that enough. It brings me back to negativity when I remember the missing pro challenges or the original levels that now lack full goal lists. I think it'll leave a bad taste in players' mouths that are looking for a more nostalgic experience, only to find that the most memorable stuff is now missing. However, I think I've said all I really can regarding my major gameplay grievances between these two versions, so let's wrap things up. Before we close out completely though, I would like to sort of rapid fire off some other differences that I consider to be minor enough to not warrant a major discussion. First up is the pro skaters, though due to many factors that go into including actual real people, this was 100% to be expected. Rotating the roster and making sure to spotlight newer pros has been the standard since the beginning, so it's something I'm fully on board with. Still, for a remake of a 20-plus-year-old game, the amount of returning pros is respectable, and like many, I was indeed excited to see the late addition of Bam Margera, even though at first glance I did think he was Johnny Depp. Cut me some slack, okay? I haven't been following him that closely. Moving over to alternate game modes, we have Create a Park, which is featured in both titles but obviously drastically different due to the innovations that come with a double-decade leap. Naturally, I would say your time is better spent experimenting with the new one due to the online ability to share your parks with other players and play with friends with much greater ease. I've never been too particularly invested in this aspect of the game, so forgive me for not having an expert opinion on this one, but I can say that in my brief experience with the mode, it did seem to indicate that the remake had the superior editing tools and slightly more objects to interact with. The soundtrack, on the other hand, was heavily discussed leading up to release, and similar to the pro skaters, there has been a major rotation, though unlike that, I think the amount of returning tracks will leave much to be desired. It was certainly disappointing to see that Pro Skater 4's opening song, TNT by AC/DC, wasn't included, but otherwise the soundtrack overall will come down to individual preferences, so I didn't want to weigh in towards one version or another. The tone of the game is another thing, though, players are likely to notice, and the one other factor that I think could turn some players against the remake as a whole. Because the game removes most dialogue and reoccurring NPCs, as well as the game being quicker overall, the raunchier jokes and set pieces are mostly removed. No mentions of cults or bums or people being drunk, everything that could be seen as only appropriate for mature audiences is sanitized. I think this is also why almost all the animals were removed and the zoo was largely abandoned, since jokes about unfed lions and knocking over penguins probably weren't considered safe, family-friendly topics. Now, I'm not trying to fearmonger about the game. You could easily make the argument that the new format just didn't allow time for jokes like these, but when you consider that the Pro Skater 3 side of the package saw the censorship of the Neversoft girls and the peeing guy in Canada, a compelling argument could be made about the remake overall being intentionally toned down. Otherwise, though, all of these factors were certainly worth mentioning, but not to the degree that I thought they could reasonably sway overall opinion one way or another. When it came to Pro Skater 1+2, which was not developed by Iron Galaxy by the way, it truly felt like a love letter to the series and those original titles while still incorporating a lot of improvements that came later, something I can't 100% say about the treatment of Pro Skater 4. As someone who typically rolls their eyes at remakes in general, the work Vicarious Visions did on 1+2 made it feel less like a pointless brand cash-in and instead more like an enhanced remaster, adding quality of life improvements and later mechanics while still maintaining what made the original two titles fantastic. In contrast, what happened to Pro Skater 4 here though feels like the opposite, scaling the game back to a point where you might even consider it a demake in everything except for graphics. My thoughts are pretty conflicted though, as you may have already guessed, because the same solid gameplay that worked so well in 1+2 still feels great here, and in a vacuum 3+4 maintains that quality, but faithful to 4 it is not even close, and I'd say in context it feels disappointing due to what it could have been. There's no way I can fault anyone for wanting to run through these levels again, which as I've already stated are beautifully recreated here for the modern visual standard. However, while the original Pro Skater 4 has the disadvantage of being trapped on much older hardware, I would still say that if you have the means, I definitely still recommend checking it out. Graphically, of course, it's a product of its time, and aspects of its humor are certainly outdated by today's standard, but as I get older, that sort of thing always ends up having a lot more charm in my opinion. One thing I can say for sure though is that my lowered expectations actually had a positive effect on how I ultimately ended up viewing the remake now, as it wasn't handled quite as sloppy or rushed as I cynically predicted some aspects would be. Overall, I think Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3+4 is fun and a worthy entry in the series, balanced at the same time as one that comes with a good handful of disappointments. At the end of the day, I think there's a nice balance to strike between enjoying something that's fun, but still recognizing where it could be flawed or not quite live up to its potential. After all, it isn't some broken, unplayable mess, so it shouldn't be represented that way, while at the same time, rightfully disappointed fans should be able to complain about the issues it does have. Not everything's ever going to be a perfect good or bad one way or the other. However, the game is still fairly new at this point, so definitely let me know if I missed anything or if you noticed anything cool, and give your overall thoughts on the game so far if you've had a chance to pick it up. I'm really trying for my next video to be a positive one, so stick around if you're interested, or check out my last comparison on the Sly Trilogy. Until next though, have a great rest of your day, and stay safe out there.